What if I told you that the greatest empire in history, which conquered half the world, was initially terrified of water? The Romans, whose legions trampled the dust of Rhodes from Britain to Egypt, were once completely helpless against the elements of the sea and did not have a single warship. All their military might, all their iron discipline and tactical genius ended where the sea began, turning formidable conquerors into confused children. The history of the confrontation between Rome and Carthage is not just a chronicle of battles, but a story of the most incredible technological and mental transformation of the ancient world. It is a story of how a land-based nation, accustomed to standing firmly on the ground, was forced to learn to walk on water in order to survive. They had to invent naval warfare from scratch, rewrite the rules of navigation, and turn the decks of ships into the battlefields they were accustomed to. Watch the video to the end to learn how Roman engineers made the sea obey the laws of land and created a fleet that changed the course of history forever. What if I told you that everything you believed about Rome's military might was completely untrue in the context of the sea? At the beginning of its journey to world domination, the Roman Republic was exclusively a land power whose interests were limited to the Italian peninsula. Their soldiers were excellent on foot, skilled at maneuvering manipuli and building fortified camps. But the sight of the endless sea filled them with superstitious terror. They had no tradition of seafaring, no experienced admirals, not even blueprints for building warships. Trade was conducted by Greek allies and the coast was guarded by small boats, suitable only for fighting small pirates. For Roman senators, the idea of creating a fleet seemed like a waste of public funds and a dangerous venture doomed to failure. The entire culture of Rome was imbued with respect for the land, agriculture, and solid ground beneath their feet. The sea, on the other hand, was perceived as a chaotic, hostile element where the usual laws did not apply and where human life depended on the whims of the wind. However, geopolitics dictated its harsh conditions, and it became impossible to ignore the threat from the sea. Their main rival, Carthage, ruled the Western Mediterranean unchallenged, controlling all trade routes. The Carthaginians were hereditary sailors whose Phoenician ancestors had explored the farthest corners of the known world for centuries. Their fleet consisted of hundreds of magnificent ships, and their crews were professionals who knew every shoal and every current. They could land troops anywhere in Italy, plunder the coast, and get away with it while the Roman legions marched along the roads. It was a clash between an elephant and a whale, where the whale could attack the elephant, but the elephant couldn't even reach its enemy. The situation seemed completely deadlocked and hopeless for Rome. Roman commanders watched with impotent rage as Carthaginian penters freely plowed the waters off Sicily, blocking any attempts to cross. Any attempt to transport troops by sea ended in disaster, as clumsy transport ships became easy prey for fast enemy galleys. It became clear that without its own fleet, Rome would forever remain a regional power, confined to its peninsula. The Republic's ambitions were confronted with an insurmountable blue barrier that had to be broken or retreated from. But there was one quality in the character of the Romans that always distinguished them from their neighbors: an incredible stubbornness bordering on madness. They refused to admit defeat even when logic and common sense screamed that victory was impossible. The Senate's decision was shocking. If we don't have a fleet, we will build one, and if we don't know how to sail, we will learn. It was like a country that had never seen snow deciding to win the Winter Olympics. The scale of the task was colossal and unprecedented in the history of that time. It was not enough to simply build a couple of ships. Hundreds of combat units had to be created from scratch, capable of fighting on equal terms with the best fleet in the world. A huge amount of timber, sailcloth, resin, and rope had to be found. But the most difficult thing was to find people capable of operating these complex machines of war. The Romans approached the issue with their characteristic systematicity and organization, turning the construction of the fleet into a national project. All resources were mobilized, entire forests were cut down, and work at the shipyards continued day and night. However, desire alone was not enough, as they lacked the technology to build modern warships. Carthaginian penters were the pinnacle of engineering at the time, fast and maneuverable. Roman shipbuilders, on the other hand, knew only how to build heavy merchant ships, which looked like carts against chariots when compared to war galleys. Attempts to create something of their own led to the appearance of unwieldy tubs that sank at the first storm. It seemed that nature itself was laughing at the attempts of land rats to conquer the sea. The Carthaginians' mockery grew louder, and the Romans' faith in success began to wane. But history favors the bold, and luck smiled on the Romans at the most critical moment, giving them the chance they had been waiting for. A coincidence that could have gone unnoticed became a turning point in a great war. This moment demonstrated that sometimes luck is more important than the skill if you are ready to take advantage of it. I am very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about the Romans' recklessness? Was it brilliant courage or the stupidity of despair? Write about it in the comments. I encourage you to subscribe to the channel to see more stories about the great adventures of the past. Guess how long it took to create this marvel of technology that changed the balance of power? Legend has it that one day a storm washed a Carthaginian Pantera, a modern 5-deck warship, onto the Italian coast. For Roman engineers, it was like modern scientists getting their hands on an alien spaceship. For the first time, they could see up close how the most advanced naval mechanism of their era was constructed. The Romans wasted no time and immediately began to carefully study their trophy. They dismantled the ship literally piece by piece, numbering each detail and sketching each fastening diagram. This was perhaps the first case of large-scale industrial espionage and reverse engineering in history. They understood the principle of the rower's arrangement, the shape of the keel, the sail control system, and the weight distribution. It turned out that Carthaginian ships were built according to a modular design, with many parts standardized and marked. This discovery allowed the Romans to introduce mass production of ships, something the world had never seen before. Instead of building each ship individually, they began to produce standard parts in huge quantities. Shipyards turned into giant assembly plants, operating as a single mechanism. The speed of construction was simply fantastic, even by modern standards. Ancient historians claim that in just 60 days, the Romans launched a fleet of 120 warships. The forest that had been growing in the mountains just 2 months earlier was now rocking on the waves in the form of formidable penters and triremes. This pace was unthinkable for the ancient world and came as the first shock to Carthage. Of course, the Roman copies were heavier and rougher than the elegant Carthaginian originals, which were made of seasoned wood. The Romans used green wood, which dried out quickly and made the ships less durable. But these shortcomings were offset by mass production and an incredible determination to see the job through. They relied not on quality, but on quantity and speed, forcing the enemy into an arms race. Ships were built all along the coast, and every city was required to contribute to the common cause. It was the first total mobilization of the Republic's resources for a single purpose. Rome demonstrated its ability to focus the efforts of the entire state on solving a strategic task. No one asked about the price, only the end result mattered. However, building a ship is only half the battle because someone has to sail it. The newly built fleet needed tens of thousands of rowers, sailors, and captains, which Rome simply did not have. It was impossible to put ordinary legionnaires behind the oars, as rowing required coordination and special skills. Finding so many professionals in a couple of months was unrealistic. The Romans hired Greek instructors and gathered fishermen and peasants, promising them pay and citizenship. But even with instructors, training in seamanship took time, which Rome did not have. War was imminent, and the Carthaginian fleet could strike at any moment. The situation called for an unconventional, paradoxical solution, and the Romans found that solution, which from the outside looked like complete madness. They decided to move the sea onto land to buy time and prepare the crews. This invention became an example of how Roman pragmatism overcomes any circumstances. You will learn how exactly these strange trainings took place in the next chapter. Something you have never seen before was happening on the beaches of Italy during those hot days of preparation for war. Imagine a surreal scene. Thousands of men sitting on wooden benches set up right on the sand, rowing in sync in the air. This was not mass hysteria or a strange religious ritual, but the largest land-based training exercise for a navy in history. Roman engineers built mock-ups of ship decks on solid ground, completely replicating the layout of benches on real galleys. Recruits, many of whom had never seen the sea, learned to keep rhythm, work their backs correctly, and listen to the overseer's commands. The skeletons of future crews were formed in clouds of dust, not in salty spray. It was an ingenious solution that allowed ships to be built and people to be trained at the same time. Officers with sticks walked between the rows, beating time and punishing those who lost their rhythm. Synchronization was the most important skill because one wrong move could confuse the oars of the entire row and stop the ship. On land, mistakes were easily corrected, but at sea they could cost the entire crew their lives. People learned to work as a single organism, turning into a living engine. These training sessions were no less physically exhausting than actual rowing under the scorching sun and in thick dust. Muscles grew stronger, and palms became covered with hard calluses, which later saved hands from bloody wounds. The Romans turned yesterday's peasants into endurance machines capable of working at their limits for hours on end. Discipline, the foundation of the Roman army, was now being instilled in the Navy. Of course, such training could not give them a feel for the waves, the rocking of the ship, or an understanding of the sea. The recruits did not know how to behave in a storm or how to avoid seasickness, but they knew the mechanics of movement perfectly and were able to obey the helmsman's commands without question. This was enough for the first stage. The rest had to be learned from the sea itself. From the outside, this spectacle provoked laughter from visiting merchants and spies who reported to Carthage on the foolishness of the Romans. The enemies believed that such land sailors would scatter at the first sight of real waves. This underestimation played a cruel joke on Carthage, for they did not take into account Roman perseverance. The laughter of their enemies only spurred the Romans to work harder. As soon as the ships were launched, the crews took their places, already prepared for physical exertion. The period of adaptation to real conditions was reduced significantly, as muscle memory was already at work. The Romans went to sea not as experienced sailors, but as well-coordinated teams of rowers. This was enough to move the heavy ships from their place and direct them towards the enemy. But even with trained rowers, Roman ships were inferior to Carthaginian ships in maneuverability and speed. The Romans understood that they could not win in a classic naval battle based on ramming and maneuvering. They needed something that would level the enemy's advantage in naval warfare. They needed to turn naval combat into something they were the best in the world at. They decided to change the rules of the game by abandoning attempts to outplay Carthage on its own turf. Instead of becoming the best sailors, they decided to make sailors fight like infantry. This decision led to the creation of a device that went down in the history of military inventions. If you like learning about such unconventional solutions, like this video, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about ancient Rome. Want to learn a secret that will change your life and your understanding of ancient naval battles? The Romans invented a device called the corvus, or crow, because of its beak-like iron spike. It was a massive boarding bridge about 10 meters long, mounted on the bow of the ship on a special swivel hinge. The design was simple, like all genius inventions, but it was the key to victory. The essence of the invention was to deprive the enemy of their advantage in speed and maneuverability. As soon as a Roman ship approached an enemy vessel, the bridge was lowered sharply, and the heavy iron spike dug firmly into the enemy's deck. The two ships were locked together, turning into a single floating platform. It was impossible to escape from this trap. A detachment of heavy Roman infantry, legionnaires, the best soldiers of their time, instantly stormed aboard the enemy ship via this bridge. A naval battle, where everything depended on the skill of the helmsman and the strength of the rowers, instantly turned into hand-to-hand combat. And in close combat, on the solid surface of the deck, the Romans were unmatched. Carthaginian sailors, armed with light javelins and knives, had no chance against the legionnaires clad in armor. The corvus allowed the Romans to use their main strength, disciplined infantry, right in the middle of the open sea. It was a revolutionary change in tactics. Instead of sinking ships with a ram, they were now captured along with their crews. The Romans effectively turned the sea into an extension of the land where they felt at home. Installing such a heavy structure on the bow of a ship made it less stable and impaired its seaworthiness. But Roman admirals consciously took this risk, understanding that it was the only way to victory. By sacrificing safety and speed, they gained a decisive tactical advantage in battle. It was a choice in favor of aggression and direct confrontation. The appearance of the Corvus came as a complete surprise to the Carthaginians, who were accustomed to traditional methods of warfare. They were not prepared for their fast and maneuverable ships to be simply grabbed and pulled in like fish on a hook. Their tactics of evasion and ramming proved useless against brute force and technical ingenuity. The Corvus also had a psychological effect. The sight of the descending beak terrified the enemy crews. They understood that as soon as the bridge fell, their fate was sealed and there would be no escape. Death came not from the water, but from the sword of the Roman legionnaire who stepped onto their deck. The first use of the new weapon proved its incredible effectiveness. The Roman fleet, which everyone had laughed at, suddenly became a deadly force. The history of naval battles was rewritten in a single day. You will learn how this first clash unfolded in the next chapter. The first serious test of the new fleet and secret weapon took place in 260 BC at Cape Melas. The Carthaginian squadron, commanded by Admiral Hannibal, namesake of the famous commander, sailed out to meet the Romans, absolutely confident of an easy victory. They saw clumsy, poorly constructed ships manned by novices. The Carthaginians did not even bother to form a battle line, attacking in a disorderly fashion, as if on a hunt. They looked with contempt at the strange structures protruding from the bows of the Roman ships, not understanding their purpose. Admiral Hannibal believed that these cranes only hindered the Romans and would make them even easier prey. Laughter and self-confidence reigned on the Carthaginian decks as they rushed at full sail to ram the Roman formation. It was a classic mistake of underestimating the enemy, but as soon as the leading Carthaginian ships got close enough, something unexpected happened. The Roman crows crashed down with a bang, piercing the decks and locking the ships together. The Carthaginians were horrified to discover that they could neither maneuver nor retreat. The trap had snapped shut. A stream of fully armed Roman legionaries poured across the wooden gangways onto the decks of the Carthaginian galleys. A massacre began, for which the Carthaginian sailors were completely unprepared. They were used to fighting the wind and waves, not professional killers in iron armor. The battle ended in a matter of minutes with the complete annihilation of the enemy crews. The remaining Carthaginian ships, seeing the destruction of the vanguard, attempted to outflank the Romans from the rear and flanks, relying on their speed. However, the Roman ships turned around, and the ominous crows fell again, capturing new victims. Any attempt to close in ended in boarding and inevitable defeat. The ramming tactic was shattered by the new reality. On that day, the Romans captured 31 ships and sank 14 more. For Carthage, this was not just a military defeat, it was a real shock and humiliation. The masters of the seas were defeated by landlubbers on their own territory. Admiral Hannibal barely escaped, abandoning his flagship. In Rome, the news of the victory caused unprecedented jubilation and a surge of patriotism. A column decorated with the prows of captured enemy ships was erected in honor of Commander Gaius Duilius. It was the first naval triumph in the history of the Eternal City, proving that Rome could win anywhere. The Battle of Melas showed that technology and tactical flexibility could compensate for a lack of experience. The Romans realized that they had found the key to victory and began to increase the production of their fleet with redoubled energy. Now they were not just defending themselves, they were preparing for a full-scale offensive. However, the war was far from over, and Carthage was wounded but not broken. Both sides were preparing for a decisive battle that would eclipse anything the world had ever seen before. Rome was gathering its forces to strike at the very heart of the enemy. But what would happen when hundreds of thousands of men met at sea? Are you ready to learn the truth about the largest naval battle of antiquity? The Battle of Cape Ecnomus in 256 BC brought together an incredible number of participants. According to various estimates, about 300,000 people and nearly 700 ships on both sides. It was a floating city ready to destroy another city just like it. The scale of this battle is comparable to the largest battles of World War I, but it all took place on wooden decks powered by muscle power. The Roman fleet, already confident in its strength, sailed to Africa to land troops and end the war with a strike on Carthage itself. They formed a complex battle formation in the shape of a triangle, protecting transport ships carrying troops and horses. This was no longer a crowd of novices, but a formidable, organized armada controlled by a single will. The Carthaginians, realizing that there was nowhere to retreat, gathered all their reserves and lined up their ships in a long line, trying to encircle the Roman wedge and strike at the rear. Their plan was to break the Roman formation, cut off the transport ships, and destroy the fleet piece by piece. They still hoped for their superiority in maneuverability and speed. The battle broke down into 3 separate giant battles. In the center, Roman ships used corvuses to break through the Carthaginian formation, turning the sea into a field of hand-to-hand combat. On the flanks and in the rear, a desperate struggle raged, with transport ships fending off attacks from fast galleys. The water ran red with blood, and the crash of breaking oars drowned out the cries of the wounded. Roman discipline and fortitude once again played a decisive role. Even when the formation was broken, individual ships continued to fight, grappling with the enemy and wielding their swords. The Carthaginians, despite all their skill, could find no antidote to the Roman boarding tactics. Their light forces were smashed against the iron wall of the Roman legionaries. By the end of the day, the Romans had won a complete victory, capturing 64 ships and sinking another 30. The way to Africa was open. This was the peak of the power of the first generation of the Roman fleet, a triumph of will and engineering. It seemed that now nothing could stop the Roman eagle, but the sea had its own plans and it does not forgive mistakes and overconfidence. The victory at Ignomus was the high point of success, followed by a terrible reckoning. The enemy the Romans faced next was not of flesh and blood and could not be pierced by a sword. In the next chapter, you will learn how nature took revenge on the conquerors for their audacity. The Romans learned how to defeat people, but they never learned to respect the sea. Their ships, weighed down by crows and overflowing with soldiers, were terribly unstable during storms. These iron gangways, designed to capture enemy ships, turned the ship into a stationary target for the elements. The high center of gravity, due to the massive gangway at the bow, made the ship prone to capsizing in heavy waves. Roman admirals, being land generals, often ignored the weather warnings of their helmsmen. They preferred to trust the discipline of the legions rather than the whims of nature, which led to terrible mistakes. The Romans stubbornly believed that the strength of their army could compensate for their lack of naval experience. They applied the same principles at sea as they did in field battles, as if the sea were just another plane. However, the waves and wind did not obey their commands, and each voyage became a test for their ill-equipped ships. Soldiers unaccustomed to the rocking of the sea lost their combat effectiveness even before the battle began. The helmsmen shouted about approaching storms, but their voices were often drowned out by the noise of the general's orders. Thus, a tragic misunderstanding developed between those who knew the sea and those who tried to conquer it. After a successful but difficult campaign in Africa, the Roman fleet was returning home when it encountered a monstrous storm off the coast of Sicily. The wind tore the sails and broke the masts, depriving the ships of their ability to stay on course. The waves became higher than the ships themselves and threw the overloaded triremes onto the rocks like light splinters. The crows that had brought so many victories now became a curse, rocking the ships and dragging them to the bottom. No one could control a ship that was too heavy and slow to fight the elements. The sailors understood the scale of the impending disaster long before the ships began to disappear into the abyss. The storm raged for so many hours that no one could tell day from night anymore. Soldiers rushed to the sides in panic, trying to lighten the ship, but it was too late. Water flooded the decks, broke the rowing benches, and washed people overboard with a single blow. Some ships tried to run aground, but the strong wind gave them no chance. Cries were drowned out by the roar of the waves, and even experienced sailors realized that rescue was almost impossible. The situation quickly became catastrophic. Rome lost more people in this disaster than in any battle of that war. Tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers died, many of whom did not even have time to take part in the actual naval battle. Hundreds of ships were smashed to pieces and carried away by the current along the coast of Sicily. It was a blow from which no other nation could ever recover, especially in the context of a long and exhausting war. All the achievements of recent years were washed away in a single night, and Rome was plunged into a period of deep reflection. People said that the sea had punished them for their pride. After this tragedy, the Romans spent several months burying the dead and collecting the debris that had washed ashore. The enormous losses shook even those who had never doubted the strength of the Republic. The Senate began to doubt whether it was worth continuing the war if the sea was taking away more than the enemy. Many demanded peace and an end to naval campaigns, but there were also those who said that Carthage should not be allowed to celebrate victory. Thus, opinions were divided in society, and no one knew what decision would be the right one. But the Romans did not give up and build a new fleet. To do this, they had to gather resources throughout Italy again and recruit people who were ready to go to sea again. However, a couple of years later, history repeated itself. Another storm and another huge squadron was lost. The sea methodically destroyed Roman ambitions, punishing them for disregarding the laws of navigation. It seemed that the gods of the sea themselves, Neptune or Poseidon, were fighting on the side of Carthage, protecting the old sea masters. The Romans began to understand that brave soldiers alone were not enough to defeat the sea. This second blow proved to be no less devastating than the first. People were already afraid to even hear the word fleet, associating it with misfortune and loss. The propaganda that had previously praised naval victories now fell silent, not knowing how to explain two disasters in a row. Even Rome's allies began to doubt whether the Romans were capable of continuing the war. But the Roman political system did not allow for the idea of surrender. They believed that perseverance could change fate. These disasters forced the Romans to rethink their approach to shipbuilding. They realized that you cannot endlessly argue with nature, especially when the stakes are too high. The huge losses of life depleted the Republic's demographic resources, and this was felt in all areas of the economy. It became clear that the tactics of land warfare at sea had its limits and came at too high a price. Now the Romans began to listen more carefully to their helmsmen and seek knowledge from Greek shipbuilders. For the first time, they acknowledged that there were areas in which they were not the best. During this period, Rome began to actively study the maritime traditions of other peoples. The Senate invited experienced craftsmen and merchants who had sailed the Mediterranean for years. They talked about how to build hulls correctly, how to take wave force into account, and how to distribute weight on board. The Romans listened, although they had previously disregarded such advice. They suddenly realized that without this knowledge, they would lose everything they had achieved. Thus began a quiet revolution in their approach to the sea. They had to admit that the corvus, for all its effectiveness, was too dangerous for the ship itself. They gradually began to abandon it, replacing heavy structures with lighter solutions. Now efforts were directed toward improving seaworthiness and training crews in classical combat. The Romans learned from their mistakes, paying for these lessons with thousands of lives. Each new ship was slightly lighter, slightly more stable, and better suited to storms. And this slowly but surely changed the future of their fleet. Military engineers began conducting the first tests of ships without unnecessary equipment. They checked how the ship behaved in strong waves and how quickly it could turn. Soldiers accustomed to land battles learned to work as a team with sailors, obeying the rhythm of the waves. This brought the Army and Navy closer together, which had previously had little interaction. Over time, the mortal fear of the sea disappeared, although respect for its power remained. The Romans began to understand that the sea required a different kind of discipline. The loss of their fleets led to the war dragging on for many years. The treasury was empty, the people were tired, and there was no end in sight to the conflict. Carthage held its ground, taking advantage of the enemy's weakness. But it was during these dark times that Rome's greatest strength became apparent: its ability to rise from the ashes. They were ready to start all over again, for the third time. This determination surprised even their allies. By the end of the war, Roman ships had undergone significant changes. Engineers analyzed the causes of shipwrecks and removed the heavy boarding bridges. The center of gravity was lowered, and the ships became more stable, faster, and more maneuverable. The Romans finally began to build real seagoing vessels, rather than floating platforms for infantry. Now the tactics of battle had changed. The Romans learned to use the ram skillfully, to maneuver and maintain formation. They adopted the experience of their enemies and combined it with their own discipline. The crews now consisted of veterans who had been through fire and water and knew the sea firsthand. The new fleet, built with private money, was the pinnacle of Roman shipbuilding at the time. It was a light model of a Pantera, stripped of all excess, designed specifically for speed and surprise attacks. The Romans proved that they were capable not only of copying, but also of improving technology. The abandonment of the Corvus also meant that the Romans began to trust their sailors more. Now victory depended not only on the legionaries, but also on the skill of the helmsman and the strength of the rowers. This was an important psychological shift. The fleet became an independent branch of the military, rather than simply a means of transport for the army. This evolution took more than 20 years, full of trials, errors, and disasters. But the result was worth it. Rome gained a professional navy capable of operating in all conditions. They went from being complete amateurs to masters of the Mediterranean. The Carthaginians, on the other hand, declined. Their navy, deprived of constant practice and funding, became obsolete. Their ships were overloaded with supplies for the army in Sicily, and their crews were hastily assembled and poorly trained. The roles were reversed. Now the Romans were swift predators, and the Carthaginians were slow-moving prey. Roman intelligence worked flawlessly, reporting on enemy movements. Admirals planned operations, taking into account wind patterns and currents. The war turned into a chess game on water, with Rome playing white and constantly attacking. Rome's technological leap forward was not only in iron and wood, but also in their minds. They created a maritime culture where there had never been one before. This legacy would last for centuries, turning the Mediterranean Sea into the inner lake of the Roman Empire. But ahead lay the final battle that would put an end to this protracted conflict. A battle where the new light Roman ships would face their old enemy for the last time. Now, everything depended on whether the new focus on speed and skill would pay off. The Romans were preparing to prove that they had learned all the lessons of a cruel teacher named the sea. Building and maintaining such a huge fleet required incredible logistical efforts, which often remain behind the scenes of heroic stories. Each of the hundreds of ships was like a small city that needed food, water, and repairs every day. The rowers, sitting in stuffy conditions, expended enormous amounts of energy and required a full diet. 50,000 rowers consumed tons of grain and thousands of liters of water every day. Otherwise, their strength would quickly dwindle. In the conditions of the Mediterranean Sea, a lack of supplies led to disease and mass casualties. Therefore, supply became more important than any victory in battle. The scale of these needs forced the Romans to think through every detail. Loading provisions took days and sometimes weeks because the food had to be distributed in such a way that it would not spoil in the heat. If even one transport was delayed, the entire fleet could be threatened by a shortage of resources. Commanders understood that safety at sea depended not only on brave soldiers, but also on accurate calculations. Every extra sack of grain could save dozens of lives on a long voyage. Therefore, they treated supply issues with the same seriousness as battle planning. The Romans had to build a complex supply system. They established bases on the coasts of Sicily and Italy, where huge stocks of provisions, spare oars, sails, and ropes were stored. These points served as reliable transshipment stations from where ships could quickly replenish everything they needed. Without this invisible support network, any fleet would have been doomed to starvation and thirst in just a few days. The Romans understood perfectly well that victories begin not on the battlefield, but in warehouses and granaries. Therefore, they invested enormous effort in developing these bases. Such warehouses were often fortified with walls and guard towers, because the loss of supplies meant the loss of an entire fleet. Hundreds of people worked at these bases, sorting grain, repairing equipment, and monitoring the quality of provisions. All supplies were carefully accounted for to avoid theft and loss. Goods were transported along specially selected routes that allowed pirates and storms to be avoided. Thanks to this, the Roman fleet could operate at a great distance from its native shores. All this work made it much more stable than the Carthaginian fleet. Water was the main problem. In the cramped hold of a galley, where hundreds of sweaty bodies worked the oars, dehydration set in almost instantly. Ships could not stay at sea for long without calling at a port or landing ashore to replenish their water supplies. This dictated tactics and limited the fleet's range, forcing the Romans to choose their routes carefully. The heat exacerbated the problem, making the water in the barrels warm and unpleasant to taste, and sometimes completely undrinkable. Therefore, finding sources of fresh water was the #1 task on any campaign. To mitigate the problem, the Romans began to improve the quality of their barrels and learned to store water so that it would stay fresh longer. They discovered that packing the barrels tightly in the shade and changing the water frequently helped to prevent spoilage. Sometimes ships made forced stops on small islands just to replenish their supplies. This process could take hours or even days depending on the conditions. But without it, the fleet could not continue its journey. Thus, simple water became a strategic resource on par with metal and grain. Wood for repairs was another strategic resource. Ships constantly leaked, dried out, and were damaged by rocks and in battles. They required a constant supply of quality wood, resin, and oakum to keep the ships in working order. Each voyage brought new damage, and ships were repaired almost continuously. The Roman economy worked at full capacity to meet these needs because the entire campaign depended on the triremes being in good working order. If repairs were delayed, the fleet became incapable of fighting. Wood was harvested in northern Italy and then transported by river and road to the shipyards. Thousands of workers felled trees, dried the wood, and prepared the materials needed by the shipbuilders. There were always workshops on the shore where carpenters could quickly replace planks or repair damage to the hull. Heat and salt destroyed even the best materials, so repairs were a constant threat. These efforts required money, manpower, and time, but without them, the fleet would have been nothing more than a collection of rotting planks. The Romans understood that the strength of any ship began with its sturdy hull. Paying crews was also a huge expense. Even if the rowers were not slaves but free men, they needed to feed their families and receive at least some salary. During this period, the Roman fleet was mainly rowed by poor people and allies who relied on a stable income. Their work was incredibly hard, and the lack of pay led to unrest. War at sea was many times more expensive than war on land, because a ship required more investment than a legionnaire. Therefore, the treasury was constantly under strain. The Senate often discussed how to allocate funds to meet the needs of both the army and the navy. Sometimes it was necessary to take out loans or introduce new taxes to support the naval forces. Dismissing rowers due to lack of funds led to a shortage of experienced personnel. Therefore, Rome tried to pay on time, even in difficult years. This helped maintain discipline and attract new volunteers. Thanks to this, the fleet remained combat-ready even in times of crisis. The Romans proved themselves to be geniuses of logistics. They standardized rations to reduce costs and improve control. They introduced strict accounting of supplies, which prevented chaos and interruptions. They ensured the smooth delivery of everything necessary, using a network of roads and camps created during land campaigns. This bureaucratic machine worked as efficiently as the military, which often surprised even their enemies. Thanks to these measures, the fleet was able to operate for a long time and with confidence. The efficiency of their logistics became a model for other Mediterranean nations. The Greeks and Carthaginians respected the organization of the Romans, although they tried not to admit it openly. But the facts spoke for themselves. The Roman fleet could withstand long campaigns when other states gave up due to a lack of resources. All this was the result of painstaking work that rarely became part of legends. However, it was precisely this work that ensured the success of the Roman military machine. People understood that victory was impossible without a stable rear. In 241 BC, the final act of the First Punic War unfolded off the Egadian Islands. The Carthaginian fleet, overloaded with grain and supplies for the besieged troops in Sicily, attempted to break through the blockade. They hoped to unload their supplies, take experienced mercenaries on board, and only then engage in battle. But the Roman commander Gaius Lutatius Catulus figured out their plan. Despite unfavorable winds and rough seas, he ordered an attack. This time, the Roman ships were light, without heavy crews, and their crews were well-trained and full of strength. Before the battle, the Romans removed everything unnecessary from their ships: masts, sails, and food supplies to make the vessels as light as possible. It was a battle between professional athletes and loaded mules. Roman triremes and penters maneuvered around the unwieldy Carthaginian cargo ships, delivering precise ramming blows. The Carthaginians could neither escape nor respond adequately. Their ships, full of sacks of grain, sank one after another. The Romans acted calmly and methodically. They broke the oars of enemy ships, immobilized them, and sank them. This time, there was no need to board the ships. Their superiority in speed and maneuverability was overwhelming. The student had finally surpassed the teacher. The defeat was complete. Carthage lost 120 ships and thousands of sailors were taken prisoner. This defeat broke Carthage's will to resist. The treasury was empty, the fleet was gone, and they asked for peace. The Battle of the Egadian Islands put an end to the 23-year war. Rome gained Sicily, a huge contribution, and the status of the main maritime power in the region. The incredible adventure of transforming a landlocked country into a maritime power was crowned with complete success. It was a victory not only of weapons, but of the Roman spirit, system, and ability to adapt. They started the war without a single ship and ended it with the best fleet in the world. The sea they had so feared became their sea, Mare Nostrum. The victory at the Egadian Islands changed the course of Western civilization. If Rome had lost, the history of Europe could have taken a completely different path. But Rome won, and its legions, supported by the fleet, were ready to march on. This war showed that nothing is impossible for a nation united by a common goal and iron discipline. The Romans proved that any force of nature can be conquered with intelligence, willpower, and superhuman diligence. Thus ended the era when Rome was only a land power. Ahead of them lay new horizons, new wars, and a greatness they had not yet even imagined. But the foundation for this greatness was laid right here, on the decks of the first clumsy ships copied from the enemy. The history of the creation of the Roman fleet is one of the most striking examples of overcoming the impossible in world history. In 2 decades, a nation of farmers became masters of the seas, breaking the backbone of the oldest maritime power. They used their engineering ingenuity when they invented the corvus, demonstrated organizational wonders when they trained rowers on the sand, and showed incredible resilience in rebuilding their fleet after terrible storms. The Romans did not just build ships, they built a new version of themselves. This story teaches us that adaptation and a willingness to learn, even from the enemy, are the main keys to victory in any war, whether in ancient times or today. Which of the Romans' tactics impressed you the most? The invention of the boarding bridge or mass training on land? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments section. What other great engineering feats of antiquity would you like to learn about? And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new exciting journeys into the past.